By 1944, the planet was drowning in blood and exhaustion, cities reduced to ash, millions displaced, nations shattered. The Allies were closing in. But Hitler's Nazi empire was still a rattlesnake, cornered and ready to strike. The world feared the next move from Berlin could prolong the nightmare for years. Yet what if the war could have ended in one single day? Hidden deep within classified archives lies the story of a mission so bold, so dangerous, that even today, historians ask, why did the Allies hesitate? This top-secret operation targeted the very heart of Nazi Germany. A strike that could have brought the Third Reich crashing down instantly. The year is 1944, and the world is exhausted. Not just tired, but broken. For 5 long years, humanity has lived under the shadow of an empire that feeds on fear and fire. Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime has swallowed nation after nation, leaving behind smouldering ruins and the silent graves of millions. The war has stretched across continents, invading every newspaper headline, every factory shift, every whispered prayer. And yet, despite the Allied victories, there is a chilling truth moving beneath the surface. The end is still nowhere in sight. By now, London has endured the Blitz, nights lit not by stars, but by burning homes and falling bombs. Across Europe, families cling to worn photographs of fathers who left for the battlefield and never returned. The United States mourns Pearl Harbor's shock and the countless battles fought in the Pacific. The Soviet Union is bleeding to death while pushing back against the Nazi war machine on the Eastern Front, losing entire cities in the process. Everywhere hope is a fragile thing. Since the D-Day landings on June 6, Allied soldiers have stormed the beaches of Normandy and carved a path toward Nazi Germany. They fight inch by inch, tree by tree, hedgerow by hedgerow, because the enemy refuses to give up a single foot of ground without drowning it in blood. The German Wehrmacht, though battered, remains one of the most disciplined and lethal forces the world has ever seen. For every liberated village, 1,000 obstacles appear ahead. Hitler's orders are clear: Germany will fight to the very last breath, and so the war drags on. The Allies win battles, but victory still feels distant. Reports flow into command centers. Intelligence assessments that read like nightmares. Analysts warn that the war could extend far into 1946 or beyond. Millions more could die. Europe's once vibrant cities, Paris, Warsaw, Vienna, Rotterdam, are scarred and hungry. And every day that passes means another mother receives a telegram that shatters her world forever. Inside war rooms in London, commanders stare at maps that no longer offer strategy, only crisis. Red pins mark territories under Hitler's control. Blue pins show the Allies' progress. It looks promising, but the cost is unbearable. Generals run their fingers along front lines that stretch thousands of miles. They ask the question no one wants to say aloud. At what point do we run out of sons to sacrifice? The Special Operations Executive, Britain's shadow army, feels that desperation more than anyone. Their entire purpose is to strike where traditional armies cannot. Sabotage rail lines, destroy factories, train underground resistance. If there is a wound in the Nazi machine, the SOE's job is to find it and cut deeper. But they have reached a terrible conclusion. Germany's power does not lie in tanks or aircraft. It lies in the iron grip of one man. The Allies know that as long as Adolf Hitler lives, Nazi Germany will not surrender. His fanaticism fuels the war. His ideology infects hearts with hatred. His mere presence demands loyalty and fear. Remove him, and the entire structure might collapse overnight. For the first time, military strategists consider a radical idea. What if the war could end with a single bullet? It sounds simple. Too simple. But intelligence reports show the German Führer has grown increasingly isolated and irrational. His decisions are no longer strategic. They are delusions of a man drowning in his own madness. His armies are commanded by fear, not logic. And every one of those decisions is signed by his hand. Kill Hitler, and the chain of command may fracture beyond repair. Yet the stakes are unimaginable. Never before in modern history has an assassination been plotted that could decide the fate of the entire world. The SOE studies historical precedents. Monarchs killed, political leaders removed, but none compare. If this operation succeeds, the war could stop tomorrow. If it fails, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Nazi propaganda machine would turn Hitler into a martyr. The German people, already indoctrinated, might fight with renewed rage. Soldiers might believe that surrender would mean dishonor in the eyes of their fallen leader. Instead of breaking them, his death could make them unstoppable. The weight of the decision is crushing. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the war's brutality intensifies. In the Ardennes, forests echo with artillery that shakes the bones of young recruits barely old enough to shave. In Italy, mountains become graveyards. In the east, entire villages vanish beneath firestorms. And every time Allied commanders receive casualty reports, the idea grows stronger: there must be a faster way. Quietly, behind sealed doors, Britain begins to ask, what if we strike at the head instead of the limbs? And thunder rolls through the war rooms as a whisper becomes a strategy. Deadly, daring, and potentially world-altering. The goal is not another battlefield victory. It is to break the spine of Nazi Germany with one single, precise act. But before any action can be taken, they must fully understand the man they seek to eliminate, his habits, his fears, his vulnerabilities. Hitler has transformed himself from a politician into a phantom, rarely seen, heavily guarded, surrounded by concrete fortresses and elite SS protection. The Allies know that if even one detail is wrong, the attempt will fail, and the war will only grow darker. Time is slipping away. Men are dying every minute. And those who lead the secret war understand that a decision must be made soon. Endure another year, perhaps two, of death and chaos, or risk everything on a mission that may last only seconds. Some believe it is destiny, that history has aligned the moment for a bold strike. Others fear the unpredictable consequences of removing the world's most dangerous dictator. Yet all agree on one thing: the longer Hitler lives, the longer World War II continues. Europe waits, its breath held between terror and hope. The world balances on the edge of a knife. And deep inside the heart of London, the most ambitious covert operation of the century is beginning to take shape. One that could end the war not with an army, but with a single sniper's pull of a trigger. The question is no longer if the war can end quickly. It is whether the Allies dare to take the risk. Even the most feared tyrant in history could not escape routine. Beneath the myth he crafted, the fiery speeches, the iron-fisted commands, the chilling propaganda posters, Adolf Hitler was a creature of habit, and habits are weaknesses waiting to be exploited. British intelligence had come to understand this with cold, clinical precision as they tracked his movements day after day, month after month. For all his paranoia, Hitler's most vulnerable moments were stunningly predictable. Far from the public eye, hidden in the Bavarian Alps, lay the Berghof, a secluded and luxurious stronghold where Hitler attempted to play the role of a peaceful leader, surrounded by breathtaking views of mountains and forests that seemed almost too serene for a man orchestrating global devastation. The location was ideal for secrecy, but it also became his Achilles heel. Here, Hitler loosened his grip on caution. Here, he allowed himself a routine that seemed harmless, but could be fatal. Every morning without fail, he would leave the Berghof and walk up a gentle path through the woods to a small, quiet tea room perched on a ridge overlooking the valleys below. He walked with only minimal guards, confident that the vast forests, mountain terrain, and loyal SS personnel were security enough. For a few precious minutes each day, the world's most guarded man became exposed out in the open, a silhouette against the dawn, a target standing still. British informants and captured German officers confirmed the pattern: same time, same route, same complacency. To the Allies, this knowledge was electrifying. For the first time, they saw Hitler not as a ghost protected by concrete and steel, but as a man made of flesh, bones and blood, killable. The thought was intoxicating. Inside the SOE's secret headquarters, maps of the Berghof were pinned to the walls. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed every fence, every guard post, every tree large enough to hide a man with a rifle. Agents traced the route Hitler took each morning, marking angles and distances. They measured the line of sight from the forest edge to the path. They calculated everything: the morning fog patterns, the rhythms of guard shifts, the typical direction of the wind at sunrise. Hitler's weakness lay not only in his routine, but in his arrogance. He believed that his intuition surpassed the need for caution. He trusted in his myth of invincibility, in his aura of destiny. Friends and close companions had noticed that he no longer used heavy armored cars or reinforced bunkers, unless absolutely necessary, he convinced himself that no enemy would ever dare strike so close to his heartland. This overconfidence blinded him to the truth. The Allies dared to try anything that could end the war. Those who worked at the Berghof remembered these walks vividly. Hitler's pace was slow, almost meditative. His hands folded behind his back. Sometimes he stopped to admire the view, pointing out details to his closest aides. Sometimes he walked alone, deep in thought, imagining a future where his twisted vision succeeded. These were moments of introspection, but also fatal vulnerability. A sniper's bullet travels faster than fear. British intelligence recognized that a single trained marksman could take the shot with near-perfect certainty. It would be over before the guards even realized what had happened. Hitler would fall. The world would change. Yet there was more to the vulnerability than just the daily walk. Hitler's health was deteriorating. Medicine bottles littered his private quarters. Reports from insiders suggested tremors in his hands, digestion issues, insomnia. Signs of a man physically weakening even as his ideological grip remained tight. His dependence on stimulant injections and unstable medical treatments made him even more predictable. His doctors insisted he maintain a strict schedule, meals at the same time, rest at the same hours, which only helped the Allies map out his life with greater detail. Every piece of information the SOE collected cemented the belief that this was the golden opportunity they had been waiting for. Hitler's predictability was the thread that could unravel the entire war. One moment, one pull of the trigger. But planning an assassination was not merely about physical vulnerability. The psychological landscape mattered just as much. Hitler's mood swings were notorious. Explosive bursts of rage followed by eerie waves of calm. His presence at the Berghof was often tied to receiving good news or needing to escape the stress of the Berlin command center. When defeats piled up, he retreated here, trying to gather the illusion of control. His environment soothed him. The mountain air made him believe that Germany could still rise above ruin. That tranquility was a deception, one the Allies sought to weaponize. The key was timing. Their intelligence officers waited for the right moment, when Hitler would be emotionally content, mentally relaxed and unsuspecting. A man at peace is easier to kill than a man at war. British analysts imagined the aftermath countless times. Hitler would be struck down mid-stride. His guards would panic, scramble, fire into the trees blindly. But by then, the sniper would already be gone, melting into the forest, disappearing into the rugged terrain of the Alps. Within minutes, radio messages would begin crackling across Germany with disbelief and denial. Shockwaves would ripple into every military headquarters. Commanders would freeze. Soldiers would feel the tremor of fear. The dictator they worshipped gone. The SOE saw something the German people could never admit. Their leader was mortal, fragile, fallible, and his death would not only tear through the Nazi power structure, it would shatter the illusion of invincibility that held the country hostage. This routine, this quiet walk through scenic woods, became the symbol of hope in the darkest hours of war. The Allies needed only courage and precision, and for those involved in the planning, one thought resonated above all: history doesn't give many chances to end a global nightmare, but when it does, you take the shot. As the operation gained momentum, whispers filled the halls of secret intelligence rooms. This is it. This could be the moment that saves millions. And all because of a dictator who believed that the beauty of a sunrise could shield him from death. The planning room smelled of cigarette smoke and urgency. Inside, behind locked steel doors and drawn curtains, a select group of intelligence operatives leaned over maps and blueprints with grave focus. They were not just strategists. They were the architects of a mission unlike anything attempted before. A single bullet to decide the fate of World War II. A single moment to determine whether millions lived or died. Operation Foxley had begun. From its earliest conception, the mission demanded absolute precision. There would be no second chance, no reinforcement team, no cavalry riding in to fix a mistake. If their chosen assassin hesitated, if the timing faltered, if even one German guard turned his head at the wrong moment, the man with the rifle would not only die, but condemn the world to prolonged suffering. The stakes could not be higher. And still, for the operatives of the SOE, failure was not a possibility they were willing to entertain. Their first task was gather every detail about Hitler's daily movements. Dozens of agents across Europe risked execution to report even the simplest of habits. At what exact minute did he leave the Berghof? Which footman brought him tea? How often did he pause to examine the trees or the mountaintop views? German routine, once thought impenetrable, became data points. And with each detail collected, the operation sharpened like a blade. The SOE field training grounds in Britain transformed into a rehearsal space for the assassination. A replica environment was built to simulate the exact terrain leading from the Berghof to the tea house. Trees were planted. Sightlines were measured. Agents spent hours observing the sunlight at different times of day to recreate how the morning haze would distort a rifle scope. They even sourced German military uniforms for the assassin and his escort, tailored to fit perfectly, so no single misbuttoned collar could raise suspicion. The chosen weapon would be a high-accuracy sniper rifle equipped with a telescopic sight advanced enough to guarantee success from a concealed distance. The man selected to pull the trigger needed not only skill but an unwavering purpose. British soldiers were considered, but emotionally, none possessed the visceral hatred necessary. For this mission, they needed someone who looked into that rifle scope and saw not a distant dictator, but a personal demon. The opportunity arrived in the form of a Polish sharpshooter with a tragic backstory carved by Nazi cruelty. His name is mostly lost to redacted archives, but the fragments that remain paint a chilling picture: his family murdered, his homeland enslaved, his future stolen. When offered the mission, he didn't ask about medals or escape routes. He asked only to see Hitler fall. His eyes told the planners everything they needed to know. This was a man who would not miss. Alongside him, a second operative would be required. Someone fluent in German, trained in deception, capable of guiding the sniper through checkpoints and patrol routes without hesitation. He would be the voice of confidence and the disguise of legitimacy. They would pose as Alpine guards, a role that required them to learn not just the language, but the culture, the mannerisms, the rigid posture of Nazi soldiers trained to obey without question. Every potential complication was dissected. How many guards were stationed outside the Berghof at dawn? What insignia should be worn to blend in? Which uniforms commanded respect and reduced questioning? Archives show lengthy debates among officers about subtle uniform details. A reminder that in espionage, even a thread could unravel a plan. The insertion method was equally critical. Parachuting into the mountains meant landing in terrain unpredictable and perilous. They practiced jumps into forests under harsh weather conditions, knowing that the Alps would not forgive the slightest miscalculation. They memorized extraction points, escape routes, and fallback signals. Though everyone knew the truth, surviving was unlikely. If either man was spotted carrying a rifle, execution would be immediate. The psychological weight grew heavier with each passing day of preparation. Killing a man, even a monstrous one, requires the acceptance of irreversible consequence. And the consequence here was nothing less than altering the trajectory of human history. What if Germany collapsed too quickly and the Soviet Union surged unchecked across Europe? What if Nazi extremists carried out unspeakable acts in retaliation? Every what if lingered like a ghost in the briefing room, but none strong enough to stop the mission's progress. They studied Hitler's personal guards, the SS officers stationed near the path. Cameras from reconnaissance flights provided blurred but valuable images of guard positions, distances between patrols, and their routine movements. The key observation during Hitler's morning walk: his guards gave him the illusion of solitude, keeping their distance to preserve his privacy and god-like persona. That arrogance was the opening the sniper needed. Hours turned into weeks as they practiced the shot. The assassin adjusted for altitude, wind shear, temperature, and the slight tremor of adrenaline that grips even the most calm, blooded killer. He trained until the rifle felt like an extension of his heartbeat, until he could place a bullet exactly where he intended, at any moment, under any pressure. The mission planners often observed from a distance, silently aware of the monumental burden they were placing on one man's shoulders. Meanwhile, experts crafted a cover story. If questioned, the operatives would claim to be part of an elite mountain patrol transferred from a northern region. Their forged papers were authentic down to the ink formula used by German supply depots. Nothing was left to chance. The SOE was building not just an operation, but a ghost that could slip through Nazi lines without leaving a trace until it was too late. As the final stage approached, the mood in the intelligence rooms shifted, meetings became quieter, conversations were held in whispers. The mission's existence was now known only to those directly involved, and late at night the planners sat alone staring at maps, asking themselves the question their duty forbade them to ask out loud. Can a single moment justify the risk of altering the very structure of the world? Yet every report arriving from Europe reminded them why the mission had to continue. Death tolls beyond comprehension. Civilians executed for crimes of identity. Children growing up with gunfire instead of lullabies. Soldiers too young to understand war, yet already aged by it. Ending that suffering made hesitation an act of cruelty. The operation had reached near perfection. All that remained was a window of opportunity when Hitler was confirmed to be present at the Berghof. The sniper and his escort waited, trained, ready. The SOE held its breath. The world stood unknowingly close to the edge of a future where World War II might have ended in a single shot. In a room lit only by a flickering lamp, a British commander finally signed the final approval document. The plan was ready. The men were prepared. The target was predictable. Operation Foxley stood poised to make history, or to die in silence. All that remained was fate. The chosen assassin sat alone in a small, dimly lit room in a hidden training facility somewhere in the English countryside. Rain tapped against the window like restless fingers, but he did not look up. His eyes were locked on a single photograph, a face that had become the very definition of evil in his life. Adolf Hitler. To most people, the tyrant was a distant figure, a monstrous architect of genocide seen on propaganda posters and in newsreels. But to this man, Hitler was not a symbol. He was the source of every nightmare that invaded his sleep. The destroyer of his home, the killer of his family. He had once been a young husband, a brother, a son, living peacefully in Poland before the war turned his world to ash. In a single night, German soldiers stormed his village. He remembered the echoes of boots on the wooden floorboards, the screams that followed, the heat of a burning roof collapsing. He remembered clutching his younger sister's hand as they ran, the gunshots behind them, the impossible choice he was forced to make when she stumbled and could not rise. Memory did not age. It stayed sharp, cruel, and fresh with every dawn. He lived not just with grief, but with guilt, as though survival itself was a betrayal. What defined him now was not the life he once had, but the man he had become in the ruins. When captured by the Nazis, he escaped with scars that would never heal. When he reached Britain, he did not come as a refugee seeking safety. He came as a weapon waiting for someone to pull the trigger. The SOE found him, or perhaps he found them. And from the first interrogation, from the cold flame in his stare, they knew he was the one. Not because of skill alone, though he was one of the most lethal marksmen they had ever tested, but because he carried inside him a reason that could not be shaken. Revenge. Yet revenge alone was not enough to place a man behind a rifle aimed at history. The planners needed to know he could remain calm, detached from emotion in the most crucial second of his life. He underwent psychological testing that pushed his mind into its darkest corners. He endured long interrogations meant to break lesser men. But he did not break. Every question asked of him, "Why do you want to do this?" had only one answer. Because if I fail, more families will suffer what mine did. The instructors observed him with a mixture of awe and fear. The silence around him felt heavy, dangerous. When he laid his finger on a trigger, it was as though the world narrowed to a single point. One heartbeat, one breath, one purpose. Other agents had nerves that betrayed them. He had nerves carved from loss. Still, beneath the hardened exterior, he remained human. At night, when sleep finally overtook him, the past returned like a storm. Flashes of fire, his mother's voice screaming his name, the crushing weight of knowing he could save neither her nor his sister. Sometimes he sat up in the dark, drenched in sweat, staring into the shadows as though expecting ghosts to step out and speak. He did not allow anyone to see that vulnerability, but he felt it, buried deep beneath layers of discipline. He was not the only one wrestling with emotions. His partner in the mission, the German-speaking escort, carried a different burden, not revenge, but fear. He feared what would come after the trigger was pulled. He feared that the death of Hitler might unleash men even more terrifying, more desperate, more willing to take the world down with them. He feared they might succeed only to damn countless lives in retaliation. There were nights when the escort tried to speak to the sniper about these fears, hoping for reassurance. But the sniper did not speak in comfort. He spoke in certainty. If he lives, more will die, he would say quietly. It ends with him. The escort never argued again. As the mission drew closer, the SOE insisted on one final test. The assassin had to fire his rifle using a mock target designed to resemble Hitler's silhouette. They placed it at the exact estimated distance of the real shot, with identical wind and terrain conditions. The sniper knelt silently, breathing slow and steady. His pulse did not quicken. He stared through the scope, and for a moment, everything around him disappeared. The observers, the training field, the ticking clock. He saw only the figure in the crosshairs. A figure that represented the end of war. He pulled the trigger. The bullet struck precisely where Hitler's heart would be. Then the sniper calmly stood, reloaded, and shot the figure again, in the same spot. The instructors looked at each other, knowing the decision was made. No one else could execute the mission with such deadly will. But the psychological toll weighed heavily on the planners as well. They were asking a man not just to kill, but to change the course of the world. They were asking him to step into a moment no human had ever faced, the exact second when history shifts because a single life ends. And not just any life. The life of the most infamous dictator ever known. They wondered, would he hesitate when the real man stood in the scope, breathing, alive, surrounded by the quiet of the mountain air? The sniper answered them without words. His every breath was a promise that hesitation did not exist in him. Still, a whisper of doubt crept through the minds of those involved. If this one man failed, if the shot missed, Hitler would know that enemies could reach him anywhere. He would disappear deeper into bunkers and shadows, the chance gone forever. Failure meant more than death for the assassin. It meant extending the war, extending suffering, extending grief across continents that had already bled too much. That pressure would have crushed any ordinary soldier. But this man did not see pressure. He saw justice. He stood not for medals or recognition. His name might never be known, his success never publicly acknowledged. If he lived, he could not celebrate. If he died, there would be no grave with honor. His mission was not about him. It was about ending a darkness that had poisoned humanity. Quietly, without ceremony, he wrote a letter on the night before deployment, a letter that would never be read unless he failed to return. He wrote about his mother, his sister, the dreams he once had. And at the end, he signed not with his name, but with a final message, for them. He folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it on the table beside his rifle. The next morning, he would be flown toward the Alps, toward Hitler, toward the moment that could end the war in one day. The human heart that carried so much pain had now become a weapon aimed at the most evil heart the world had ever known, and the world waited for the shot that never wavers. The war rooms smelled of coffee and exhaustion. Papers were scattered like fall leaves across the long table, as men who had seen too much argued in low, urgent voices. The idea that a single bullet could end the war had moved from fantasy to plan. Now it bumped against something more complicated and chilling. The unknown that follows the fall of a tyrant. The room split into two camps. One side measured lives saved by a single bold stroke, thousands freed, cities spared, battles never fought. The other saw a black, immediate future, the Nazi machine snapping like a viper into unpredictable violence. When you hold the fate of nations in your hand, even hope becomes a thing to fear. Churchill paced the map-strewn floor in Whitehall as cables arrived from Washington and Moscow. He knew how to gamble on decisive blows. Dunkirk, the Blitz, the convoy routes. But assassination was different. It carried a moral weight that no conventional battle did. Killing a head of state, even a monster, raised legal and political questions. Would the Allies be seen as judges, executioners, or desperate victors? If the shot hit its mark, what would rise from the ashes, surrender, or an SS blood purge that made the Holocaust look like a prelude? No plan lived in isolation. Every action would echo through occupied Europe, through the Soviet Union's hunger for influence, and through the fragile coalition holding the Allies together. The intelligence briefings grew darker as analysts laid out credible scenarios. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was painted as the most likely successor to seize power through ruthless, centralized terror. Military men whispered about Himmler's control of concentration camps and SS security networks, a force that did not answer to the Wehrmacht's chain of command and could, in crisis, morph from protector of the Führer into the engine of retribution. The SS had both the will and the means brutal cadres loyal to ideology, not to a national banner. If Hitler died suddenly, Himmler, or another senior SS leader, could declare martial authority, tighten the vise on civilians, and launch retaliatory purges against anyone deemed disloyal. In that world, death would breed more death. Others warned of fragmentation rather than centralization. The Wehrmacht, humiliated and exhausted, might fracture into regional warlords. Field commanders could pursue local survival strategies, cutting worst-case deals or opening new fronts. An assassination might not be a neat transfer of authority, but a cascading collapse that turned Germany into a chaotic battlefield. Imagine towns where SS units fought Wehrmacht officers, where civilian councils tried to hold back reprisals and failed. The potential for indiscriminate slaughter was terrifying, and all because the Allies had chosen to remove one man. Then there was the propaganda danger. The Nazi machine had long made of Hitler a mythic figure, Führer, saviour infallible. For years, the regime had carefully curated images of his strength, his destiny, his divinely ordained mission. Intelligence officers argued the risk that a violent, public assassination would create a martyr, a spiritual rallying point. Even as soldiers in the field bled for scraps of land, propaganda ministers could spin the assassination into a story of ultimate sacrifice, demanding extreme loyalty and reprisals in his name. The more public and dramatic the killing, the more potent the martyr narrative. Killing Hitler in a blaze of scandal might inflame a population already conditioned to worship him, turning demoralized forces into fanatics. Practical military concerns cut through moral debates with cold precision. Would killing Hitler actually speed surrender, or would it stiffen resistance, forcing a longer, bloodier campaign? Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front painted a grim picture: fanaticism, scorched earth orders, executions of hostages. There were credible fears that Hitler's death could remove a single restraining voice, perverse as that sounded, and unleash a series of commanders who, freed from centralized order, would escalate terror rather than capitulate. The cost of a misjudged blow might be millions more lives. At night, the men in the room imagined the alternatives. Assassination planners argued that the Third Reich was a personality cult. Strip the cult of its idol, and the apparatus would collapse under its contradictions. They pointed to regimes that imploded when charismatic leaders were removed, and to the inertia of bureaucracies that collapse when their axis of meaning disappears. To them, a surgical covert strike, precise, deniable, and quick, could shatter the command chain before it reorganized. The uncertainty of violence, they said, was preferable to the certainty of slow, grinding slaughter inching toward 1946 and beyond. Across the table, diplomats worried about the post-war map. The Soviet Union had paid the greatest price in blood and was advancing steadily. Stalin's appetite for influence over liberated Europe was voracious. Would a sudden German collapse create a vacuum that Moscow would fill uncontested? Allies from Washington fretted about spheres of occupation, about Poland's fate, about the moral authority to dictate terms if the war ended through an extrajudicial killing. Even if Hitler's death led to surrender, how would the world manage the aftermath? Occupation trials, reconstruction. These required a political architecture that assassination might undermine. The ethical dimension gnawed at them like an infection. Many men in the room had sons in the trenches and names of the dead pinned in their memory. They felt the visceral pull to end the slaughter by any means. Yet they also knew that endorsing assassination as a policy could set a precedent. What defended the Allies from being judged as murderers themselves? How would history view a world in which democracies resorted to clandestine executions to solve geopolitical problems? The moral gamble was enormous. There were also intelligence uncertainties that made the debate practical, not just philosophical. No one could guarantee the shot's precision under real-world conditions. No one could promise the assassin's escape. If the mission failed spectacularly, Hitler would be more careful, more secluded, and the chance to strike him might vanish altogether. Failure would be public fodder for Nazi myth, making and would harden the enemy's resolve. As the debate reached a fever pitch, small human stories threaded through the arguments. A young intelligence officer, his voice tight with emotion, described letters from a father in Normandy whose unit was trapped and starving. "If we wait another year," the officer said, "I will have to write to his wife and tell her why I did not act when I could have." An older veteran countered, his hands trembling, recalling the massacre of civilians in Eastern Europe. "If we remove him and the retribution is worse," he said, "will my conscience survive knowing I made murder more efficient?" In the end, the decision was not made solely in the war room. It went up to cabinets and conferences, into the quiet of prime ministers' studies, and across radios to presidents who had to balance public opinion, international law, and the grim arithmetic of lives. The debate itself became a microcosm of the Allied alliance military urgency pulling one way, legal and political prudence pulling another. The mission that promised to end the war in a day became a mirror reflecting every fear and hope of a world at war. When the final recommendations were assembled, they bore the scars of compromise. Operational plans were detailed, rehearsed, and poised. Yet over them lay a moral and strategic fog that could not be pierced by maps or bullets. The planners knew they were playing with destiny. They also knew that sometimes history refuses the clean ending a film might offer. The most disturbing thought lingered in the back of every mind. Removing a monster might not end evil. It might only rearrange its shape, so the debate ended not with a shot but with silence. The mission remained a razor-edged option, ready but restrained. History would march on toward its eventual close, with choices made and choices deferred. The terror of responsibility had done its work. It had forced men to weigh the cost of a single act against the sprawling catastrophe it might unleash. And in that cold calculus of war, even the hope that a bullet could save millions had to share space with the shadow of what might be lost if it did not. The plan was polished until it gleamed like a blade. Maps were spread, escape routes designed, disguises tailored, and rehearsals executed with mechanical precision. The officers driving this mission believed deeply that if fate aligned just once, if Hitler walked into the crosshairs at precisely the right moment, they could cut out the brain of the Nazi war machine and choke the life from the Third Reich overnight. They had seen too many battles, one only to be followed by more suffering. They believed that one bullet or one perfectly placed bomb could do what entire armies struggled to accomplish. It wasn't just strategy anymore. It felt like a duty to the dead. Their conviction was fed by intelligence reports showing signs of strain within Hitler's closest circle. Generals questioned his sanity behind closed doors. Officers whispered of hopeless fronts and doomed offensives. Supplies dwindled. The German population, battered and grieving, felt the war tightening around their throats. The architects of the assassination believed this moment, when the regime trembled on the edge, was the most dangerous and the most promising. A push now might send the whole structure crashing down. Delay, and the war might grind through another year of fire and blood. Yet the courage required to pull the trigger was not theoretical. It lived inside the hearts of the select few who would walk into Hitler's presence knowing there would be no second chances. Some of these men were decorated soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to him. They had marched beneath his banners, celebrated his early victories, and believed he had revived Germany's pride. For them to become traitors in the eyes of their nation required a transformation far more painful than any battlefield wound. They had to kill the man they once trusted, not for personal gain, but to save the soul of their homeland. Nights were restless as the chosen conspirators wrestled with fear and responsibility. They knew that success meant saving millions, but failure would mean unimaginable torment not only for themselves, but for their families and innocent civilians. There would be no mercy if they were caught. The SS did not simply execute traitors. They erased them, annihilated every trace of their existence, and punished anyone who had ever spoken their name affectionately. Every conspirator signed this mission with the blood of those they loved most. Training intensified in basements and isolated fields. Operatives practiced moving silently in heavy boots, reciting memorized routes, and concealing weapons in strange angles of their uniforms. Bombs were redesigned to be smaller, quieter, deadlier. Fuses were tested again and again under the trembling hands of men who could not afford to doubt them. They studied Hitler's patterns, his late arrivals, his spontaneous detours, his habit of rarely staying long in any exposed location. The plan's greatest enemy was unpredictability. On paper, the assassination seemed almost elegant. A briefcase bomb slipped beneath a map table, a concealed pistol fired from a few steps away, a sniper hidden at the edge of a parade ground. There were multiple contingencies and backup triggers, any one of which could alter the course of global history in an instant. But history is uncooperative. It resists perfection. Information arrived that Hitler's health was deteriorating. Some planners worried that nature might rob them of their target before they could act. Others feared he would withdraw deeper into bunkers and never again appear in a space reachable by agents. Time became an enemy. The longer they waited, the more the war devoured. Bombing raids incinerated cities. The Eastern Front swallowed divisions whole. At what point did caution become complicity? Letters home from the conspirators grew shorter, more cryptic. A few wrote final confessions, to be delivered only if they did not return. One officer sat alone in his study, a glass untouched beside him, and whispered apologies to his sleeping child, knowing that if he died a traitor, that child might grow up bearing a name cursed in every street. Yet he continued. He pinned his hopes to the belief that future generations would understand, even if the present did not. The day of action approached like a storm. Orders were distributed with trembling precision. Weapons moved quietly across checkpoints. The conspirators rehearsed their final steps in their minds, making peace with the idea that each breath could be their last. Some prayed, others clenched their jaws and tried to bury their fear under duty. All of them burned with the same desperate desire and end. Then, as if fate itself sensed the plan and chose to interfere, complications emerged. Meetings shifted by minutes. Hitler altered his schedule without warning, cancelling one appearance entirely. A bomb that should have detonated failed because a critical component malfunctioned in the cold. An assassin who had sworn he would not hesitate found his arm frozen by the weight of the moment and the sudden knowledge that one mistake could doom more lives than it saved. Opportunities slipped away like smoke through open fingers. Worst of all were the near misses. One day, the conspirators placed their device within reach of victory. The briefcase sat just feet from Hitler, ticking its way toward justice. But a last-minute change in position. Someone nudging the case behind a sturdy oak table leg shielded the FU from the blast. The explosion ripped through the room, killing and maiming those nearby, but Hitler emerged shaken, singed, and alive. The perfect strike had been ruined by seconds and inches. Chaos followed. Screams echoed. The conspirators tried to pivot the operation into immediate overthrow, but Hitler's survival spread like wildfire, and fear paralyzed would-be supporters. Arrests came swiftly. Torture rooms filled. Families vanished into the night. The regime's vengeance confirmed everything the conspirators feared, but too late. Those who lived long enough to face trial stood before judges who didn't need proof. Their guilt was assumed, their punishment predetermined. Some went to the gallows in silence. Others shouted their love for Germany, hoping history would someday hear them clearly and not through the twisted language of the regime. They had failed, but they had failed boldly. And while the war raged on, their attempt left a permanent bruise on Hitler's psyche. He became more paranoid, more reckless, more determined to drag the world down with him if he could not rule it. The chance to shorten the war had slipped away. Millions more would die before the nightmare finally ended. Yet even in failure, the conspirators carved a different kind of victory, a moral one. They proved that resistance existed even in the darkest heart of tyranny. They showed that courage does not always triumph, but it always matters. Their legacy lived beyond the bomb that didn't kill its target. It lived in the question their attempt forced the world to face. What does it mean to stand against evil when success is uncertain, and the cost could be everything? What if Operation Foxley had launched? Would World War II have ended instantly or spiraled into darker chaos? Some secrets of war may forever remain unanswered,